Michael sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the cold November rain pattering against the windows like an unrelenting reminder of the emptiness that had engulfed his life. A glass of whiskey sat half-empty on the table, untouched for an hour as his mind wandered through the ruins of the past few weeks. His brother, James, had died tragically in a car accident, a collision so violent that it left Michael hollow, the kind of emptiness that gnawed at the soul. James wasn't just a brother. He was a confidant, a best friend, a business partner. They had grown up together, fought together, and survived the cruel twists of fate together. They had plans, grand ones. Michael felt like he was living in a ghost town, haunted by his brother's absence. His apartment was a shrine to James. Photos of the two of them adorned the walls, as kids, as teenagers, as adults who had braved the world. The pain was unbearable, a never-ending sting that even whiskey couldn't dull. It had been a week since the funeral. The silence in Michael's life was so deafening that he found himself avoiding his apartment, staying out late, immersing himself in work. But tonight was different. Tonight, the weight of James' absence was heavier. Michael sat on the edge of his couch, staring into nothingness. When it happened, his phone rang, the screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the room, illuminating the shadowy corners like an unwelcome guest. He glanced at the number. Unknown. He hesitated. Who would be calling him at this hour? Maybe a work emergency. Or worse, some telemarketer who didn't care that he was grieving. The phone rang again, insistent. Michael let out a sigh and finally picked it up. Hello. His voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper. There was nothing. No reply. Just the faintest sound of static, like a radio caught between stations. Hello? He said again, louder this time, irritation creeping into his voice. Still nothing. Then, just as he was about to hang up, there was a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible sound on the other end. It was the unmistakable rhythm of breathing, slow and shallow. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. It couldn't be, no. It wasn't possible. He quickly hung up and tossed the phone onto the coffee table, trying to shake the eerie feeling crawling up his spine. It was a prank, he convinced himself. Some sick person with too much time on their hands. But then the phone rang again. Michael stared at it, paralyzed. The unknown number flashed across the screen once more, glowing ominously in the dark. A cold sweat began to form on his brow. Every instinct told him to ignore it. But something else, something darker, compelled him to answer. He grabbed the phone. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice quivering. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." Silence, and then, barely audible over the static, a whisper. A single word, Michael. His blood froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was James. No, it sounded like James. Michael whispered, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands began to tremble. "James, is that you?" More static. The voice didn't respond, but he could feel it. Whoever was on the other end, it wasn't a stranger. The phone cut off abruptly, leaving Michael in the suffocating silence of his apartment. The echo of his brother's name hanging in the air. Over the next few days, the calls persisted. Always from the same unknown number. Always the same eerie static. Sometimes there was breathing, sometimes there was nothing. Michael became obsessed, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything but the phone. He would sit in the dark, waiting, anticipating the next call like a man possessed. His work began to suffer. His friends stopped calling, unsure of how to deal with his increasing paranoia. One night, the phone rang again. But this time, something was different. As Michael answered, the static cleared, and a voice broke through. "Michael, help me," the voice pleaded. "James." It was unmistakable this time. Michael's heart raced. He clutched the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "James. Where are you? How is this even possible?" "I don't know," the voice replied, weak and distorted. "I'm trapped. You have to find me. Please, Michael. You have to." The line went dead. Michael sat there, stunned. His mind raced with impossible questions. Was James alive? Was this some kind of twisted prank, or had he lost his grip on reality? He had to know. He had to find out the truth. The next few days were a blur of research and sleepless nights. Michael dove deep into theories about the afterlife, ghostly phenomena, anything that might explain what was happening. His obsession drove him to the brink of madness. He barely ate, barely slept. The phone calls became more frequent, more urgent. The voice, James' voice, begged him for help, but offered no answers. Every call left Michael more unhinged, more determined, and then, a breakthrough. One night, after hours of combing through old family photos, Michael found something that sent a shiver down his spine. In the background of a picture from their childhood, a picture of James standing in front of their childhood home, was a figure, barely visible in the shadow. A man. Michael hadn't noticed it before, but now, in his heightened state of paranoia, it was impossible to miss. The man's face was obscured, but his presence felt ominous, like a blot on the memory of their youth. Michael's heart pounded. Who was this figure? Was it connected to the calls? He had to know. He began investigating their old home, which had been abandoned for years. A feeling deep in his gut told him that the answers were there, waiting for him. After a week of fruitless phone calls to real estate agents and dead ends, Michael made a decision. He had to go back. The night was thick with fog when Michael pulled up to the house where he and James had grown up. The windows were shattered, the paint peeling off the walls like dead skin. The air was thick with the smell of decay, as though the house itself had been rotting in James' absence. With a deep breath, Michael stepped out of the car and approached the door. His hand shook as he reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked. But it wasn't. The door creaked open, groaning as if it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of their childhood. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture stood exactly where they had left it. The memories were suffocating. He could almost see James running through the halls, hear their mother calling them in for dinner, but something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was alive and watching him, and then the phone rang. Michael fumbled with his phone, his hands trembling. The unknown number flashed across the screen. He answered it. "Michael, help me, please." James' voice was weak, desperate. Michael's throat tightened. "Where are you, James? How do I help you?" There was a pause, a long stretch of silence that made Michael's heart race. Then, a whisper, "The basement, the basement." Of course. Michael had forgotten all about it. As children, they had never been allowed down there. Their parents had kept it locked, claiming it was unsafe. But that didn't stop James from sneaking down there once, dragging Michael along with him. they had only gone down once, and Michael had never forgotten the feeling of dread that had washed over him. Something was wrong down there. Even as a child, he had sensed it. With trembling hands, Michael found the door to the basement and pushed it open. The darkness swallowed him, cold and thick. He descended the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood beneath him echoing through the silent house. At the bottom, the air was damp and foul, smelling of mildew and something far worse. Michael's phone buzzed in his hand again. Another call from the unknown number. He didn't answer this time. Instead, he followed the faint glow of his phone screen as he stepped deeper into the basement. Then, he saw it, a figure, standing in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. "James?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure moved, slowly stepping into the dim light. It was James, or at least, it looked like him. But something was wrong. His face was twisted, contorted in agony. His eyes were hollow, empty. "Help me," the figure rasped, reaching out toward Michael. Before Michael could react, the figure lunged at him, and the world around him went dark. When Michael awoke, he was no longer in the basement. He was standing in the middle of a forest, a dense, oppressive darkness surrounding him. The trees seemed to bend and twist unnaturally, their branches reaching for him like skeletal hands. The phone in his hand rang once more. "Michael." Michael's heart raced as the phone rang in his hand, its glow the only beacon in the terrifying black forest that surrounded him. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, his pulse pounding in his ears. He stared at the phone, trembling. His brother's voice echoed in his head, "Help me." He pressed the answer button with trembling fingers, bringing the phone to his ear. "Michael." The voice on the other end whispered, distorted, as if coming from another dimension. The voice was James, but not entirely. There was something deeper, darker lurking beneath the familiar sound, something that chilled Michael to his core. "James," Michael whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "Where are you? What is happening to me?" The line crackled with static for a long moment, then the voice returned, weaker this time. "You have to remember. Remember what happened that night." Michael froze, his mind spinning. What night? He couldn't think straight. His memories of the past few weeks were a blur. James' accident, the funeral, the phone calls. Everything had merged into a fog of grief and confusion. But there was something familiar about what the voice was asking of him, something buried deep in his memory, just out of reach. "I don't understand," he said, frustration and desperation clawing at his throat. "James, please. Just tell me what's going on." There was silence again. Then a sharp, high-pitched whine that made Michael wince, holding the phone away from his ear. When the sound finally stopped, the voice came back, clearer this time, but filled with pain. "You were there, Michael. That night, you were there." Michael staggered backward, his legs feeling weak. His mind raced, trying to piece together the broken fragments of his memory. He was there. The night of James' accident. But how could he forget something so significant? Suddenly, flashes of that night flooded back, James driving fast, too fast, the rain pouring down, the blinding headlights of the oncoming car, the violent impact that shook his entire world. But there was something more. Something he hadn't remembered until now. Michael sat in the passenger seat that night. James had been drinking, as usual, after yet another argument with their father. Michael had begged him to slow down, to pull over and let him drive, but James was stubborn, as always. Angry and reckless, he had refused to listen. In that flash of memory, Michael saw his own hand reach for the steering wheel, trying to stop James from swerving out of control. But it was too late. The crash was inevitable, he remembered now, the horror of the moment when the other car collided with them, the twisted metal, the sound of James screaming in agony. And then, nothing. His memory had gone black after that, but now, standing in the middle of the eerie forest, Michael realized the terrible truth. He had survived the crash, James hadn't, but he hadn't been alone that night. There had been something else, someone else in the car with them. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the forest around Michael seemed to close in, the trees growing taller, their branches wrapping around him like chains. His breathing grew labored, his vision narrowing. The phone buzzed again in his hand. The unknown number flashing across the screen. This time, the call wasn't from James, a cold, unfamiliar voice whispered from the other side. "You can't run from the past, Michael. You were always meant to remember." The voice sent chills down his spine, and Michael realized with growing dread that the figure in the shadows wasn't his brother. It was something darker, older, a force that had been following them both, something neither of them had understood. "Who are you?" Michael demanded, panic setting in. "What do you want?" The voice on the phone laughed, a low, haunting sound that echoed through the trees. "I want the truth, Michael. The truth that you buried. The truth about what really happened that night." Suddenly, the forest around him shifted, the trees contorting into grotesque shapes, their bark peeling away to reveal hollow, screaming faces. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and Michael stumbled forward, desperate to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The phone fell from his hand as the world around him twisted into a nightmarish landscape, pulling him deeper into the abyss of his own mind. And then, he saw it, the car. It was the same car from that night, mangled and crushed, its metal twisted like a crumpled toy. The headlights flickered weakly in the distance as Michael approached, his legs moving as if against his will. He could see James in the driver's seat, his lifeless body slumped over the steering wheel, his face pale and bloodied. But there was someone else in the car too, another figure, sitting in the back seat. As Michael stepped closer, the figure turned to face him. It wasn't human. Its eyes were hollow, its skin gray and decayed, like a corpse that had been buried for centuries. And yet, its gaze pierced through Michael, burning into his soul. "You invited me in, Michael," the creature said, its voice dripping with malice. "That night, when you reached for the wheel, you called out to me. And I answered." Michael's stomach churned as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about James. This was about something far darker, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of their lives for years. The accident had been the catalyst, but the darkness had always been there, waiting for its moment. "You made a deal," the creature hissed. "A life for a life." "No," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, that's not true. You tried to save him, but you were too late," the creature continued, its form shifting and warping, becoming more grotesque with every word. "And now, you have to pay the price." The phone buzzed again, but this time Michael didn't answer. He stared at the wrecked car, at James' lifeless body, and the creature sitting in the back seat, grinning with wicked delight. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the truth bore down on him. He hadn't just lost his brother that night. He had made a choice. In his desperation to save James, he had reached out to something dark, something unnatural, and now it was time to face the consequences. The creature stretched out its hand, beckoning him forward. "Come with me, Michael. It's time to fulfill your end of the bargain." Michael shook his head, backing away in terror. I didn't mean to. I didn't know," the creature's grin widened. "But you did, Michael. You knew exactly what you were doing. And now, there's no escape." The ground beneath him began to crumble, the forest collapsing into darkness. Michael fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head as the memories flooded back, the weight of his guilt suffocating him. James' voice echoed in his mind, pleading for help, but it was too late. There was no saving his brother. There was no saving himself. As the darkness swallowed him whole, Michael heard the phone ring one last time. This time, he didn't answer.